think about this, how the Texas football season will be judged. I don't have to tell you good or bad. I'm going to tell you how it's going to be judged, and you can take the scorecard of this. I think, disagree if you like, you can take this scorecard and just apply it throughout the year, and you'll know. Now, you may have some disagreement. That's cool. I think this is how I would judge the Texas football season. It's 5 ways. 5 very clear, straightforward criteria. I'm not saying they can't do better, but it's how you would judge the season. You meet this metric, and you could say it's a pretty successful season. Because a lot of stuff kind of comes out of this. So there's 5 ways to judge the Texas season. 1, you make the 12-team playoff. That's not that hard to do since the whole thing is set up to favor the SEC and the Big Ten. It's basically built for 2 leagues. But you have to make the 12-team playoff for it to be a success. Now, with that comes another number. What is the maximum number of losses that Texas could suffer and get in? They get in with 2. I think they get in easily with 2. They lose 3 games. It's a lot has to go their way. Now, you have to step back and understand this 12-team playoff system. Unless you win your league, then it's all about that goofball committee that meets in some airport Marriott, smokes cigarettes, and has bagels. That selection committee still matters, which I think is awful. And so that always going to benefit Texas because their name is Texas. So they probably get a break that somebody else would not get. They have to make the 12-team playoff or the season is not a success at all. There's no argument there. That's a bad year. It's a 12-team playoff. 2 losses get you in. 3 might even get you in. Number 2, well, you can't have more than 2 losses. That would be considered a bad year. Period. Number 3, you have to beat Oklahoma. You're going to think, well, but what about some other stuff? You just lost to them a year ago when you were the double-digit favorite. You can't do it twice. And I'm going to tell you a bigger reason why I think you can't lose to Oklahoma again. Because you're in a mid-October stretch. You know who you play the next week? You play Georgia. That would be 2 losses in the middle of October that would define your season. So you have to beat Oklahoma. 4, you can judge it on playing for an SEC championship. 5, you can judge the season winning 2 playoff games. You could argue even deeper than that, but 2 playoff games is probably acceptable. You could probably call that a pretty good year. That means you're among the best 8 or so. It's hard to argue with that. Now, this thing about the middle of the season, a 2-week stretch defines Texas's season. Because otherwise they've got a favorable schedule. I know, blah, blah, blah. They go on the road to Michigan. Michigan's starting from scratch. And it's a really, really good Michigan defense. Might be the second best defense Texas will play all year. But otherwise on offense, Michigan is completely starting over on offense. And they're starting over with an assistant coach. That's a game Texas should probably win. Now, later in the year, Michigan might end up being better. But early on, it's clearly advantage Texas at the beginning of the year because Texas has got a quarterback that's played a ton of snaps. Michigan is starting from scratch. So the defining stretch in the season that decides everything, I think, is mid-October. Mid-October, obviously, you're in Dallas to play Oklahoma, and then you get Georgia and Austin. If it defines their season, first the Oklahoma game. You can't lose to Oklahoma again. You can't. Dylan Gabriel is gone. Texas made him look like Joe Montana and Tom Brady combined. Throw in Patrick Mahomes, too, a year ago. They're starting over at quarterback. So you can't lose that game. And the bigger reason why, well, the obvious reasons why you can't lose that game is you turn around the next week and you play Georgia in Austin. And you might get your face kicked in. You go 0-2 in mid-October, your season is defined, and it's defined probably in a negative way. So the whole thing, all 1 through 5 can then sort of stop at this particular time during the season, and you're defined by that October stretch. You know, you shouldn't be losing to Oklahoma twice anyway, particularly that they're starting over at quarterback. I mean, Texas shouldn't have lost to them a year ago, but their secondary was absolute trash. So That defines you. Now, if you want to say, but Jeff, what if Texas were to lose to Oklahoma and then turn around and beat Georgia and run the table? Okay. In that scenario, if that's really the way you see this thing playing out, I don't. But in that scenario, sure, I guess you can call the season a success. But it's tough to bounce back. You're almost playing with house money in Austin against Georgia if you're coming off a win against Oklahoma. A good showing is viewed as a positive. Keeping it close is viewed as a positive. Georgia's the best team in the game right now, and it may be by considerable margin. So you beat Oklahoma, you got house money the very next week in the biggest game in Austin in probably my life, I would say. Yeah, that's not an exaggeration. And I'm in that many huge games in Austin. So that Oklahoma game decides, you leave the Oklahoma game undefeated, then all of a sudden that Georgia-Texas game is the most marketable game of the year outside of Ohio State, Michigan, which may lose some of its buzz if Michigan loses a couple of times. So it might very well be a setup where the Texas-Georgia game in Austin is the biggest and most defining game of the regular season in college football. In fact, if you had to bet money on it, I think it would matter more if Texas beats Oklahoma. It would matter more than Michigan and Ohio State. Not historically, but for the 2024 season. So you can't lose to Oklahoma if you're Texas. You just can't. So you can't turn around and go 0 for 2 in October, mid-October, and expect good things to come your way. So, and I don't know anyone that thinks they would run the table, lose to Oklahoma, run the table by beating Georgia. So I think it's doubtful. It's a doubtful way to go about it. Now, if Texas were to be really good, have to be great, be really good, go on the road, you beat Michigan at the Big House. Again, they're starting over. You turn around and beat Oklahoma, who's starting over at quarterback. You've got a favorable schedule. The Georgia-Texas game is the biggest game of the season of 2024. It's the biggest home game I'd submit to you that Texas would have had in, let's use Jeff's lifetime. And I was a kid sitting in the knothole collecting cups. Okay, so I've been around a long time. It's not going to be bigger than the playoff and all that stuff, but it will be the biggest regular season game of next season. It'll be the biggest game in my lifetime in Austin, because that'll be 1 versus at worst 3. And they might both be undefeated. And it would probably be blown completely out of proportion. But that game, if the setup is right, if Texas takes care of business against Oklahoma and doesn't fall on their face in the secondary again, that game is not only defining the regular season of 2024, it's the most marketable game of 2024. Arguably might be the biggest number in terms of ratings of 2024. And it might decide 2 of the 4 or 5 people that end up in New York for the Heisman Trophy. That night, day, whatever. Absolutely. Some would argue if both of these teams, and again, Texas is a pretty easy schedule. I mean, they've been given the greatest benefit you could get by going into the SEC. Go 10 for a hat, all you want, but they've got a good setup. They're defined by that 2 weeks in October, and some could argue between Carson Beck and Quinn Ewers, whoever comes out of that game that afternoon or night in Austin might just win the Heisman Trophy. That's how much that game could matter if Texas beats Oklahoma the week before. They don't, and they're scratching and clawing, trying to earn some credibility, and it is a giant buzzkill if Texas were to come into the Georgia game with a loss. Right? That's how you judge their season. You can talk all you want about covering the spread against, no-name directional schools. No, not really. The 5 ways you define their season is making the 12-team playoff, obviously. It could happen with 2 losses. You could lose to Georgia, get in the playoff. You beat Oklahoma. You win 2 playoff games. Play for an SEC championship, which I think was sort of like icing. I don't know they have to do that. And then it's all decided by mid-October, right? And it would be the most high-profile game in Austin. I don't know what else would come close. People, there was an atmosphere. Gosh, it goes back to 90 or 92, whatever it was. David Klingler in Houston, which is a really good team. Texas plays them in Austin. But let's be honest. Yes, it was a big night in the Southwest Conference in a big game. Their name is Houston. It can't be that big. So it didn't have, and never will have the appeal of a undefeated Texas versus an undefeated Georgia, who is an eyelash away from winning 3 straight national championships. That would be the biggest setup of a game in Austin that I know of. I don't know what else it would be. I'm somebody from the 50s or 60s might weigh in, so if you want me to qualify this, I'll say from 1980 on. How's that? From 1980 on. That's what all sets up for them. That's how you can sort of check the boxes on their season. And I think they're all fair. I think they're all reasonable. I think the stuff about beating up on, some direction, beating up on Colorado State by 20 or 50 doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. You've got 5 points, 5 metrics. That's how you're measured.